only mode.
Welcome to the Industrial Control System Information Sharing and Analysis Center's monthly public briefing. We'll take another minute or two to give those who are still logging in a chance to complete the process. During this time, I will provide some housekeeping guidelines. If you are calling in on the phone, you will find a PIN number on the GoToWebinar application. Please enter this PIN into your phone and press pound. This will allow us to manage any background noise. My name is Debbie Wendell, and I will be moderating today's session. I serve as Community Director for the Center and oversee the Center's human-to-human information dissemination mechanisms. In case you're not yet aware of the full range of collaborative products that we have to offer, make sure that you check out our LinkedIn group, Twitter account, and website blog posts. Plus, we hope that you will take full advantage of these briefings, as well as our Thursday open forum discussion sessions. Our goal is to get our members accurate, timely, and actionable information in a way that best suits their needs. Today's briefing, Where oh where is the knowledge to share, features a panel of distinguished subject matter experts, including Zach Dexter, founder of Databracket, Dwayne CTO at Tripwire, and Steve Parker, president of EnergySec. And it will be facilitated by ICS ISAC Chair Chris Blask. During today's presentation, Chris will take the first few minutes to lay some background to frame the issue. Next, the panel will spend about 35 to 40 minutes for their discussion. And finally, there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. I will be attempting to keep as many of you as possible off of mute so that you can speak your thoughts or raise questions as appropriate. But please mute your headsets or phones if necessary to help reduce unwanted background noise. When speaking, if you would please introduce yourself and indicate your industry affiliation. Additionally, if you'd like to ask a question, you may also use the hand raise feature in the GoToWebinar application. After the meeting, a recording of this session will be available on the Center's website. So now, without any further delay, Chris, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for coming along. As Debbie says, I'm going to do a little bit of slideware, a little bit of discussion to frame things, and then we're going to open it up for a panel discussion amongst the four of us. I know from seeing the registration and seeing some of the folks who are online right now, there's a lot of people who are in attendee mode who are as qualified as those of us, up here on the virtual stage, and strongly encourage you to raise your hand, shout out questions, ping the organizers, ping Debbie through the chat tool and so forth if you'd like to join in the conversation. So this panel is here to talk about the sources of information. So where is knowledge and how do we get it? And we specifically want to talk about where we've gotten to right now. I believe, and many of us believe, we're at a crux. We're moving in a certain direction for a long time. And in a lot of ways, we've been looking for love in all the wrong places. We've been looking to Washington, D.C. specifically, looking to the public sector to share information with us, tell us what we need to know, need to do. And while there is a lot of unique information in the public sector as a whole, and in the U.S. federal public sector, in Washington, D.C., and so forth, specifically, at the same time, there's a lot of limitations to it. It's that the government doesn't have all the subject matter experts. The four of us, up here are in private industry. All of our peers, the vast majority in private industry, it's a known issue that the government has a hard time hanging on to the best expertise in these sorts of areas. They're certainly not the best paying jobs that the best people in the world can get. The information the government has is hard to share. If you have intelligence information on what Al-Qaeda and enemies of the states and so forth are about, and that's important to share with infrastructure owners and operators and integrators and so forth, how do you actually do that? A certain somebody currently making the airport in Moscow, a long-term vacation spot, has just made that even more complicated. If the NSA can't hire a contractor with all those legal agreements and get them to see anything without causing international incidents, how does the federal government get this information out at all? So while we have artifacts like the Presidential Executive Order and PPD 21, Presidential Policy Directive 21, and the NIST framework and other issues in the federal public sector working on how they enable slightly more sharing of slightly more information to a slightly broader demographic. In the end, that can't be the sole source. You know, the scalability at the very best is low. You know, you look at the processes like the CISCP, the ECS, and other acronyms, you know, in Washington parlance, the mechanisms that the federal government is putting in place to share information, they're generally set up to share with, you know, a couple dozen organizations. However, we have hundreds of thousands and millions of individuals and facilities and systems and so forth that need this information. And finally, by the time you go through all this process for the vast majority of information coming from the federal government, it takes a while, understandably. It's both a large bureaucracy with all that implies, and it's got more lawyers than engineers. And again, we're not picking on the government, it is what it is. Anybody who's worked with or worked for the government knows this. So that by the time you vet something enough to get it out of the government to everybody else, it may be too late to use. So for all those reasons, while we all want all of our public sector partners, federal, state, municipal, and so forth, to work with us and share what they can, we need to look in different places. You know, and not surprisingly, given the topic of this conversation and all that we're always about as a community and as a center and so forth, we have some opinions on where that knowledge is. And it's, as you probably deduced, hopefully from this graphic, it's in front of us. It's under our noses. The workforce that has the expertise is primarily private sector. You know, if you want to find the people who really know this stuff, most of them are not working for the government. The infrastructure is almost entirely owned by the private sector. You know, I hear 85% all the time. Frankly, I think that's got to be an underestimate. I think the vast majority of infrastructure, particularly in the U.S., is privately owned. All of the vendors, everybody who makes all the products that all of this stuff is made out of, are in the private sector. All of the integrators are private sector. So most of the knowledge, both in terms of in the heads, you know, who knows about this stuff and who has the best effective information and knowledge we can use, is private sector, and the assets that should be where we're getting the live telemetry from and awareness of what's going on are in the private sector. So as opposed to having a star topology, a mainframe network approach to knowledge, where we're all sitting back and waiting for the government to tell us what to do, we need to be, and in fact are, developing knowledge sharing networks, where facilities underlie the base of it. Where facilities have to be able to both use knowledge shared with them, or there's no point in sharing it, and they need to be able to tell the rest of us what they're doing, without obviously falling down all the rat traps of not being able to share one reason or the other. So we have facilities, we connect them with each other appropriately with service providers and with centers, and we build on the experience of everybody involved and address the common concerns so that what we find in water can inform power, that what municipality sees in their systems can be shared with other municipalities so they can be forewarned and forearmed, so that what countries see can be shared amongst each other appropriately. So to that whole end, you know, the ICS ISAC has initiated a project called SARA, the Situational Reference Architecture. It's designed to be a project that leads to a actionable set of guidelines and demonstrated set of guidelines so that facilities and integrators and others can both take the technologies out there and the process with best practices and use them. We are specifically not creating standards. We're looking to capture standards, capture practices, document them, and make them available in a guide format. So the way we look at things, what SARA is specifically structured around, and regardless, we think is the appropriate way to consider these things, is that for any given definition of us, you know, particularly as facilities, you know, we're a facility. We need to know a couple of things. We need to know who we are. You know, for example, we're a nonprofit, municipally owned wastewater system that we have to have an awareness of how we do things. You know, our decision-making process is driven by city council. You know, the risks are identified by me talking to my boss, whatever that is. You know, we need to have an honest view of who we are. And there's assessment methodologies that have been developed to do this. And throughout the industry over the last 20 years, we've gotten better at that. We need to make this consumable and available to asset owners so that they can each get a grip on their identity. Every facility needs to know what they have. If they don't know what they have, they can't use the information shared with them. A vulnerability comes out for a device, they don't even know if they have it. Obviously, they're not going to use it. And they need to know, if their networks are changing. Is somebody plugging something in or not? If so, and it wasn't me, and I'm running the network, I'm running the facility, then it's always bad. And they need to know what their systems are doing. And knowing these things, then again, they need to know how to use information shared with them and how they manage to share something with others, or whether they can or not. So inside SARA, there are 2 artifacts or activities worth knowing about. There's a guide itself. There's a document being compiled with these 4 sections with the support of vendors like Tripwire and Databracket and others among our membership, in cooperation with other centers such as EnergySec. Steve Parker here with us today. And we're implementing a pilot. So we're connecting, we're taking asset owners and performing these activities, performing the assessments, putting the technologies in place so they can determine who they are, what they have, what it's doing, and bidirectionally share information, and connecting them with centers like EnergySec and the ICS ISAC. And doing these things in initial form between now and the end of the year, and in the next form, throughout 2014, expand the pilot itself and expand the documentation. So, with all of that, hopefully not being any longer than I promised to be, I'd like to just launch into the panel conversation. I have a couple of questions coming up out there already. Certainly, we can think of a lot of them. But just to get initial thoughts from my fellow panelists here, as Debbie said, we've got Dwayne from Tripwire, who's the CTO, with a great deal of experience in all this. With a Tripwire, as most of you are familiar with, is an open source, founded on an open source technology that is the Tripwire tool is the de facto way to see what your file systems are like and that they're changing and so forth. And they've built quite a large commercial vendor on top of that. Dexter is CEO of Databracket, which is a new startup, has another interesting open source methodology of looking at state and change among host systems that applies interestingly to this. And Steve Parker, many of you know, is the president of EnergySec. And EnergySec is both a private sector knowledge sharing and analysis center and run by Steve and the other folks there who have enormous experience in the electric sector. So if we can start with just initial comments, and we'll just take it in the order listed there for no particular reason. So Dwayne, do you have thoughts you want to throw out, at least on the premises that I was putting out there and where we are in the world?
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind is that there seems to be a lot of discussion about sharing information and the question about where things are. And one of the advantages I think we have as a vendor that works with a lot of different entities is that we are kind of a proxy for benchmarking across different companies, different organizations, and that allows us to see what kind of threats are happening across different environments, what kinds of countermeasures have people implemented, how are they monitoring, how are they consuming this, and effectively it allows us to create kind of a playbook that we can use to help one organization learn from another very quickly. So I think Chris, you and I were talking about the fact that a lot of people are kind of waiting for guidance from the government on a lot of this stuff, but you don't have time to wait for this. So if we can find easier ways to do this cross-connect and bring data together, hey, here's what we're seeing. Are you seeing that? Here's what we're doing about it. What are you doing about it? And start to get kind of a shared awareness of the battlefield, if you will. I think then that's definitely what I think the spirit of all the information sharing we've been talking about really is. And I think that as a vendor, we look forward to finding ways to be a productive member of that conversation without getting in the way.
Yeah. Well said. And Debbie reminds me that I ran over a little bit and I stomped on your intros that she has better than I. So Debbie, you want to take a minute and introduce our panel?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would love to do that. Well, first we have Dwayne Melassa, and he is Tripwire's Chief Technology Officer, where he owns a critical role in driving and evangelizing the company's global overall product strategy. He brings over 25 years of security software experience and is responsible for leading the company's long-term product strategy to meet the evolving data security needs of global enterprises. Since joining Tripwire in 2000, he has spearheaded numerous initiatives, including executive responsibility for business development, professional services and support, information systems, and marketing. Prior to joining Tripwire, Dwayne held leadership roles at DirectWeb, Symantec, and Fifth Generation Systems. He is certified on both IT management and audit processes, holding both ITIL and CISA certifications, and is a frequent speaker at national and regional industry events. Dexter is founder of Databracket, an innovative software solutions developer with global clientele. From their corporate headquarters in North Carolina's Research Triangle area, Databracket has unparalleled access to highly skilled science and engineering talent and have used this advantage to develop a broad organizational background in computer security, software engineering, and project management. Steve Parker is the president of the Energy Sector Security Consortium, or EnergySec. He was part of the grassroots effort that led to the formation of EnergySec and has served on its board of directors since 2008. Steve's experience includes more than a decade of full-time security work at critical infrastructure organizations, including the Western Electric Coordinating Council, Pacific Corp, and U.S. Bank. He has contributed to a broad range of security projects covering areas such as e-commerce, identity management, intrusion detection, forensics, and security event monitoring. So as you can see, we have quite a distinguished panel lined up for you today. So Chris, you want to go ahead with the remainder of your discussion?
All right, thank you, and I apologize for running ahead as I am wont to do. So Zach, if you have, as you know, you've been educating me on the approach that you take to these sort of things. I think your technical approach is very interesting. Are there any first thoughts you want to throw across the bow?
Yeah, definitely. I guess the first thing I'd say is that I'm really interested as a startup in looking at these lab environments that are coming online. There's actually one down in North Carolina where we're based called the Energy Production Infrastructure Center, and there's of course the ICS lab that ICS ISAC is developing. And as someone looking to enter this space, I think these lab environments are pretty critical to make sure that the sharing techniques we're implementing actually help asset owners, and we can have a low integration time. And the only other thing I'd say to start off is that, of course, right now sharing is not perfect, and we've got to reduce the time gap between when a vulnerability is detected and when the sharing happens. So that's what we're working on. I'm sure we'll get into that in more detail later.
Indeed, no doubt. And Steve, I know you talk almost as too much as I do, so I know you can have a thought or two with all your experience. You want to throw an initial comment out there?
Yeah, I will. I'm just kind of listening to this, and I think I want to start off in kind of a real abstract, some abstract comments about information sharing in general, and I'll give you a couple anecdotes. Going back to probably the mid-'90s, the first time I ever installed Linux on a computer, I had my little lab in my home office, and I got Linux up and running, got the command line, and I was all excited because I had a Unix machine, and called my wife in and said, "Hey, check this out! Look at this!" And I got this up and running. She just looked at the screen and gave me that blank look. And it's like, okay, what do you do with it? And I looked at the screen, and I'm like, what do I do with it? I don't know. The point being, I was excited because I had this cool new technology, but it's really about the applications. And in information sharing, I think we get the same blank look from people when we talk about it. The term information sharing is so overused. So many people are talking about it, and yet so few real applications, I think, have been seen by the great unwashed out there that there's a lot of skepticism about the topic. It really does come down to the applications. It's like, what do you do with it? What information can we share, and what benefit do we get from sharing that information? And that's that's the question I think that we need to be answering and need to be working on. I'll throw another kind of abstract analogy out there, and Chrissy and I have talked a number of times and kind of used the internet as a metaphor for what we're trying to do here. If you look back and think over how the internet has evolved and developed over the past couple of decades, if you had gone back, come on and say, 1995 even, and shown somebody an iPhone, or tried to explain to them what an iPhone would be and what the internet would become and the applications that would be available and all this, I think they would have a hard time envisioning how you would build that. Because the internet is not a product, it's a compilation of things that have evolved over the years. And there's three attributes that I think apply to the internet that I think you're going to need to apply to the information sharing infrastructure that needs to be built. One, interoperability based on open standards. Two, the ubiquity of access. And three, a free market for applications. We need, and we're very early in the process of building out an information sharing infrastructure. But we need to have the open standards that allow for interoperability so information can flow basically from anywhere to anywhere, assuming that all parties agree that that information should move. We have the capability to do that. There needs to be a ubiquity of access so anybody can plug in to this infrastructure and share information and get information back out of it. And there needs to be a free market for applications. So innovative vendors, whether they're a nonprofit research group or whether they're a for-profit commercial entity, they can then build on that infrastructure and deliver the applications that are going to deliver value to people. Because ultimately, you have to do something with it and you have to get value from it or people are not going to participate. I'll leave it at that and then we'll continue the conversation from there.
Yeah, so I'll pick that ball up. The very interesting analogy as well with the internet itself. You're exactly right. And in my looking back at my own experience, I remember in 1990, when I was first involved with the internet, and it was actually, we were selling internet connectivity first, and then through the complications of that ended up creating up a firewall, getting into security, and everything else is history, or at least infamy. But the couple of conversations stand out in those days. Very bright people, still pushing back on the whole idea of the internet. Like the one conversation I'm thinking about, we're talking about websites. The web was just starting to emerge, and this one person saying, who's going to put all this content out there? I was like, well, everybody. Why? What do they get out of it? Like, well, lots of things, and lost that argument completely at the time. Obviously, won it over the long term. And a couple of pushbacks at that point that are I agree, that are very similar to when we're talking about information sharing, knowledge sharing these days. There's a lot of skepticism by very, very bright people. So it's not their problem; it's our problem. We're not visualizing this. And the second part of that, I think, is a lesson that I learned, in the subsequent years, early '90s, when you get friends and family, like all of us who are net folks back in those days. You get a friend or a family member who says, "Well, I'm thinking I get you on the internet. I got to get a computer. Can you help me figure out a reason?" And I found, that my stock answer was, pick one. It doesn't matter which one. You're a grandparent. You want to send emails to your kids and grandkids. There you go. That's it. Just get, as soon as you have a reason, do that. And we'll talk in 6 months, and a year, and 2 years, and 3 years, and I'll find out you're doing all sorts of things that I never thought of. But you have to have that first solid reason. And where we are right now, aside from, so I listed at the beginning, we're, in the topic of this conversation, we're looking for information from the wrong source, and and the wrong level of emphasis, the wrong level of exclusivity. We're really only thinking about how we get information from the government. And when we look at the other direction, as you touched on, we say, how do we get information from asset owners? A lot of really bright people say you don't, because it's been tried, they've got pissed off, they're not doing anything, they're afraid of getting sued and regulated and everything else, and yada yada. It won't work. So how we get the application.
If I can jump in, Chris.
Please.
If I can jump in just briefly and interrupt you there. They are giving up information. It's one of the notes that I had coming into this. They are already sharing information. They don't know that they're doing it, or they don't view it as sharing information. If you go out and you buy a spam firewall, your vendor who's running that firewall now knows where all your emails coming from. They see at minimum they see the headers, the subject line, and in most cases they're probably seeing the content as well. And so you're sharing that with that vendor. That vendor is aggregating all that data with all their other customers. It's similar to what Dwayne had mentioned earlier with Tripwire. They have lots of customers. They see things that are going on in their customers, and they can then aggregate that. So information is being shared. We just don't call it that. So it goes back to your one thing. That's how you get started. And the question is, how do we take it to the next level? And I'll let others talk now.
Well, and yeah, just an observation on that. I mean, it is true that we get a lot of information from our customers, but we've been very careful to make sure that the sensitive data, for example, the results of your vulnerability scans and things like that tend to reside on site rather than being pushed up into the cloud, unless you consciously push it there for that reason. Because I mean, if somebody gains access to that, and all of a sudden they know how an organization is vulnerable, and whether they're paying attention to those vulnerabilities or not, and things like that, I mean, that's something that would be dangerous in the wrong hands. So a lot of this, some of it is, be careful what you accidentally share. The other is understand that what the people you're sharing the data with are actually doing with that data, and kind of go in with your eyes open so you don't end up getting blindsided by, a third party that you didn't realize was being kind of, playing fast and loose with the data. So, and I think that, from when I talk with a lot of people, there's certain areas that come up pretty often. One is, I'm not really sure I know how to share. I'm not really sure I know what to share, who to share it with. Sometimes I get information, I don't know what to do with it. So a lot of this gets down to a lot of organizations really not understanding how to have a productive conversation around threats and around risk and about, best practices and things like that. So I think that to me feels like part of the opportunity of this is how do you facilitate that effective conversation and not just, become just a data source and have no clue how people are using that data.
Yeah, and a couple. I mean, these are such central issues that we come up against them all the time. And what both of you have just said is absolutely true. That people are sharing data all the time already, and we have lessons learned in the broader internet that can apply to this. And I recall very clearly, the early, at least in my tenure, the early internet days, when it was a concentration of very technical people and enthusiasts, and these sorts of issues would come up. And quite often the agreed position was the internet won't work, or people won't do certain things because the kinds of people really focusing on that point wouldn't do it themselves. And privacy and information sharing, and these are really the core issues going back that far. And the reality is that, as you said, as Dwayne, you and Steve both just said, people are sharing information. We actually share a lot of information all the time, and I swore to myself I wouldn't beat Snowden to death, literally or figuratively on this call. But it's again true. It's been very interesting the common public reaction. A lot of civil libertarians and other people are disgusted the American public hasn't risen up in revolt. But the reaction has mostly been, well, yeah, yeah, it's okay. Yes, they're watching over us. And people are okay with it. And Steve, I mean, you mentioned losing the point a little bit, but in the electric space, electric operators share information with each other constantly. That's how they keep the grid up.
They do, from an operational perspective. They do, and on the, I'll throw out another internet analogy. If you think back to probably the late '90s, when people were talking about e-commerce, and there was this great fear, oh no, we're going to do e-commerce on the internet. I'm not going to give my credit card to somebody on the internet. I'm going to have financial fraud. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, we're now taking pictures of checks with our cell phones and depositing them remotely into our bank accounts, and you don't bat an eyelash at it. So a lot of the concerns and fears that are around information sharing hopefully will go the way of some of the fears we had about e-commerce and online financial transactions. Obviously, bad things can happen and probably will happen, but in the aggregate, we're going to be far better off than we would be if we didn't do it.
Well, I mean, we're all security people too, so at the end of the day, we, as much as we get wrapped up in our own world, we're good at understanding the choices. That people worry about terrorists and guns and so forth, and really red cars on Wednesdays are more the lightning, sharks, and terrorism. You're more likely to be killed by a red car. So only do the appropriate things. And Dwayne, you made great points as well. It's about, and I find myself talking about these things a lot. It's like some of the pushbacks you get are so obvious. Like for example, it's like, oh yeah, we'll take all this information, we'll put it in one big pool, and as soon as somebody hacks that, we all die. And then the answer is, well, no. We share things. It depends. It's not binary. It's not I'm a hermit living in a cave, or I'm a zombie in a compound, right? There's levels and levels of sharing. So sharing data with your vendor, sharing information with your peers, sharing information with the feds. I mean, these are all different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's another aspect of it too that I'd be interested in everybody else's thoughts on this, is where, there's a lot of talk about standards and automation and things like that, and I think, that's part of the, the solution, but at the same time, just automating things that don't get used or don't get used effectively really doesn't help. So how do you get into a mode where not only are people able to consume this data, but they're able to build it into their risk framework to be able to, drive meaningful action on this, to be able to determine whether it's relevant or not. And I've seen a lot of organizations that aren't really well prepared to do that analysis. Whether it's a case of, some technician is now assigned the job of security and doesn't really have enough context to know what to do, or doesn't have a clear line of sight in terms of what the organization's risk framework is. It seems like a lot of times we're creating information that people don't use or don't know how to use. And be interested in, Zach and Steve, your thoughts, and yours too, Chris, on how do we solve that problem?
I'll let somebody else, Zach or Steve, you want to jump in there? I'll take too much microphone time anyways.
Sure. So as to information that people don't know how to use, I mean, it's an interesting problem for us, because we're actually working on helping people share code that's tagged with a bit of context, and we have two types of code detectors that detect events on asset owners' hardware, and then responses. And we're running into this issue where not everyone has people who are competent in scripting detectors and responses on. I mean, it's a very technical thing, right? And in order to get people to actually use this detector or this response information that they're collecting and that they're sharing on this open source platform we're building, we have to kind of tag it with keywords or with some kind of context that fits it into the larger picture of the organization's asset security. So I guess the way that we've approached that is we've diagrammed out what your, I guess the whole picture of what or all the different facets of your assets security. So basically for servers, you might have like 20 or 25 different categories that you've got to look at. And we've placed all the attack detectors and attack responses in those categories. So we're trying to have a very technical approach, but at the same time allow people to place these attack detection attack detectors and these attack responses in a larger context. So I know that's pretty general, but I mean, just broadly speaking, if people who are non-technical can look at the technical platform and get a good idea of how it's being deployed and exactly what problems it's solving, I think that's a good thing. So that's our approach right now, is building up that extra context around the very technical stuff.
Yeah, and that, a conversation just before this call that circled back to this issue a fair bit, or at least what I think is my response to this issue is that there's a fair bit of technology to the answer to that question, and there's a fair bit of sociology. I think one of the fine points of all this is, I believe, that we have this feeling that in the IT world as opposed to the ICS world, the IT world in security is very advanced and very sophisticated and completely mature. And quite often I get this feeling that, and I know that the ICS people, the industrial people, get their backs up fairly frequently by having a bunch of frankly smartasses from IT come over. And in reality, this is something we haven't done really well in IT. There are certain lessons we can port from the IT world into the ICS world in how you identify risk, and how you get past the technical level into the management operations. But I think a lot of the decision making in IT and IT security is still done for technical purposes, or it's done because an executive may have read an article somewhere, and it's not necessarily it's not developed as it is in other contexts. A question from the audience at a conference earlier this year in Doha. We're talking to energy sector asset owners and so forth, and somebody was gotten really quite hot. And saying, how is it, we have software coming out with so many bugs, we don't have airplanes like that. And the point was that we're decades and decades ahead in the airline industry, in the automotive industry. I mean, the 57 Chevy with a death trap, and the 32 Ford, wouldn't make it off the line today at all. So we're still in the stage where across the board, I don't believe that we have really good adopted practices in IT, in industry at all, for how organizations assess their risk and make decisions about what to do. And there's some places I think in ICS is actually better poised than IT for these sort of things. IT is dynamic and crazy, and everything else industrial facilities aren't. It's a little more programmatic approach to the physical engineering than there is to information engineering. Steve, you want to throw anything onto that? Or go ahead, Dwayne.
Well, I was just saying that, to me, some of it, if you compare it to the airline industry, I mean, there are standards, there are checklists and things like that that are kind of common across carriers and things like that. And I think, we're starting to get to that point in IT. When you look at things like SCAP and OVAL and some of the standards for expressing how things should be configured and how much you can trust them and things like that, that's a good baseline. And then you layer on top of that, some of the, the ability to share threat information in a structured way, to be able to kind of do an apples-to-apples comparison of one set of infrastructure to another versus threats. So I think we're getting there, but it feels like one missing piece for a lot of organizations is having a really clear, structured approach to risk-based security, so that you don't try to create everything equally, because you drive yourself crazy, or you create so much information that the organization can't absorb it, or you end up where you can't rationalize the deployment of resources or the acquisition of new capabilities because you can't establish the value of that investment to the mission. So it feels like some of this is, there's the blocking and tackling of understanding what I have and how it's configured, understanding what the threats are, but there's this, to me, in a lot of organizations I work with, this missing link of a clear risk-based approach to prioritizing and segmenting and things like that. I wanted to find out if you guys have seen that same challenge.
Steve, you want to throw something in there?
The biggest challenge that I see, the biggest challenge that I'm seeing is just the workload that is on everybody. So any activity which creates more work is probably not going to be looked upon favorably. And I think the information sharing oftentimes falls into that category. An example, I can talk about that. We're involved with the program that Department of Homeland Security runs. It's the CISCP program. And Chris, I think the ISAC's working on that as well, where they throw out indicators of compromise and various other analysis things. Again, there's another source of data that an analyst would need to go and look at on a day-to-day basis, creating more work for them. They are now putting out those indicators in STIX format, in an IODEF format, in CSV format, so that the capability is there for people to automate consuming those. And that's a good thing, because now it's something that provides value that doesn't necessarily create more work. And that's the challenge we have. And Dwayne, you mentioned OVAL and SCAP and those things. And these protocols are coming out. And that's a good thing, because they lay the foundation. Before you could have a web browser, you had to have HTTP and you had to have HTML. And once those standards are in place, now you can figure out what you're going to do with it. Well, we're getting those standards in place in the protocols for exchanging information. I think now we're at the point where discussions are, okay, what do we do with it? What applications do we provide that actually reduce workload instead of increasing workload?
Well, and you mentioned having too much to do, and to me that just really underscores the need to have a good approach to, categorizing things based on risk and value to the mission, because otherwise you'll never have enough resources to do everything. So how do you logically segment the work in a way that you agree, your executives agree, the regulators agree, anybody you have to answer to would agree that you've made wise choices on how you decided what to do and what not to do. And I think, from what I'm seeing is that some organizations are very mature in that way and they have a clearer picture of that. Others, it feels like, are still in a very reactive mode where they don't have everyone on the same page about how they make those risk-based decisions. And let's face it, like the NIST risk management framework is a little cumbersome for a lot of people to adopt. So a lot of times I spend a lot of time thinking about how to apply risk and not actually integrating risk into their decisions.
Yep. So we've got a couple hands raised and a couple of questions out there. So let me go to Oscar. Oscar, I'm going to take you off mute, and Oscar is with the Guatemala CERT. So an interesting perspective on all this. So do you have a question for the panel, Oscar?
No, excuse me for the delay.
Oh, no problems whatsoever. Well, welcome in. So we have we have Joel Langle with us. Joel, I'm going to take you off mute if you would like. I see your question out there, but you're quite eloquent yourself. So you're off mute. Joel, you want to state your piece? Or I can read it out for you. So Joel, well, you may be finding your review button or not. But in any case, let me read the question Joel put out there. In an ICS architecture, the majority of IP addresses belong to non-Windows assets. How is this being addressed in relation to the threat surface they offer potential attackers and the inability to protect with traditional security controls? I can think of responses for that, but Joel, if you can
Chris, can you reread the first part of that question?
Sure. In an ICS architecture, the largest majority of IP addresses belong to non-Windows assets. How is this being addressed in relation to the threat surface they offer potential attackers and the inability to protect with traditional security controls? And I think, I know I can, it's in the context of what we're talking about, where the information is, where knowledge is. Oh, we lost Joel. Let's have the technical problems. But I guess the question could be put into the context we're talking about, that a lot of the information, there's a lot of abstract knowledge in the industrial space. There's a lot of devices that have nothing to do with IT security. There isn't an IT security base of information to apply to them. But however, they interconnect in a very programmatic and known way, and that we can apply tools like we look at it with SARA, situational awareness tools. With SIM tools, we can look at traffic, we can look at where things are going, we establish. This is one of my favorite hobby horses, frankly, is that we can do a lot without knowing a whole lot. We can look at facilities and establish what they're doing now. And with a little bit of work, a little bit of effort, determine that that is more or less correct. And look for deltas in that. To make changes, to make attacks against, to exploit, as Joel says, the attack surface, you need to make something change. Joel, you're back. So I'm going to take you off mute again. There you are. You want to? I think I can hear you, Joel. You want to?
Yeah, I think I'm back off mute. I don't know what happened there. As soon as you unmuted me, I dropped. So anyway, I don't know what you said after I lost audio. Did you read the question that I typed?
Read the question, and I was giving a sort of generic answer of the ability. So to put my point out there, you said basically, how do we deal with a lot of the non-Windows stuff, the threat surface that they offer attackers? One of my responses was that we can do an awful lot without knowing a lot. That where we have the ability to have awareness of what's going on a network and what it consists of, and can work with the asset owner to at least confirm that that's generally correct. That locking that down to exploit that attack surface, I have to change this somehow, to change the traffic, change the nature of the network.
Yeah, but the problem that we continue to face is that everybody falls into the same mindset of doing things the way IT's been doing it for the past couple decades, and that we're seeing that just doesn't work. So everybody believes that all of the risk lies in a compromise of a Windows-based machine. So everything they're doing is focused around the indication of threats going after common assets, and they're really neglecting the largest majority of those assets, which are not Windows. They're running maybe third-party OSs. Some of them are running proprietary stuff, and it's just, it would be nice to see some change in that space, because all of the indicators, everything ICS CERT does is targeting Windows assets. There hasn't been an announcement really published from them that provides any value of the endpoints. It's all the intermediate nodes. So I'm kind of wondering how Sarah and everything else is going to change that, because right now, who has all of the data? So all of these startups are being created where they say they have the data, and that's where the sharing is really breaking down.
Well, I think that frames it well for my purposes, because I think you and I agree a lot of those points you put out there, but a lot of the knowledge is facility specific. It's not about Windows and Unix or real-time operating system or anything else. It's that here's what my facility is. I've got these 3 Ethernet switches, I've got an HMI and a SCADA server and some PLCs and these devices, and they speak to each other over an IP Ethernet network in a certain pattern over certain ports in certain ways, and that's right. I know it's right. I built it myself. And I know and knowledge. That's what we're talking about. The government doesn't know this, and nobody externally can know this. But quite often, and this is where an architecture like Sarah can help. You have to walk through the purpose of identity. Who are you? Well, we're a manufacturing facility and such and such. Okay, what do you have? We're not really sure. Well, okay, let's fix that. Here's the devices you have. Here's their IP addresses, MAC addresses. Here's what they are. And what do they do? Well, we're not really sure. Well, there are ways to figure that out too. They talk to each other, report these IP, TCP, UDP ports, whatever. And you can get into the data packets. Again, to your even though it's a sort of pushback point, nonetheless, these are IAT technologies that we have out of the box, free, just out there. And there's commercial solutions and everything else. So with that, we have a facility then, they know themselves. They know their own stuff. They know when it's not about whether or not their Windows box has a vulnerability or their CMP PLC has a vulnerability. It's whether somebody tries to exploit it. And in that case, who knows? There is no advisory. ICS CERT or nobody else knows about this. Only the bad guys know about this vulnerability. It's port, 1, 2, 3, 4,
so you're falling into the same rut everybody else does. You're assuming that the device has a vulnerability, The device doesn't need a vulnerability. The system does. And we are doing nothing to address system-level vulnerabilities. Everybody's doing component-level work. And trust me, when we demonstrate these attack scenarios in classified environments, they're deadly because people are missing it. It has nothing to do with a vulnerable device anymore. So we got to stop thinking that it's just like securing a desktop. It's not. It's really not about that anymore. And that's where I'm really hoping that things are going to move. And, you know, a lot of us are getting discouraged that we continue to be led by organizations that are thinking like an IT security mindset, and they're not thinking from a manufacturing mindset. So that's where the big shift's going.
Well, or even system level.
I hear Dwayne nodding there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, you know, and this is one of the areas that I'm spending a lot of time on right now. We're doing some projects around attack surface analytics and attack path analytics and things like that to try to get to a better, you know, like a holistic system view of this, because it is always, I mean, look at, you know, take it out of the device-centric world and you look at a lot of the information compromises that have happened with, you know, federal agencies. Some of them exploit, you know, sort of lax security practices in federal contractors to get into the mothership, into the agency. You know, so that's kind of what we're looking at is like, even though the system's not vulnerable, if it's configured weakly or if it allows you to do something really easy to get onto the network, now you can use that as a launch point to go in and do, you know, bad things, then, you know, the system may not be vulnerable, but it's configured in such a way that it allows you to get to critical assets. And, you know, I think you're exactly right. And to me, this also fits into that discussion around risk, where, you know, if I can tell you about threats, but it's up to you to decide whether that threat is relevant to you or not. And it isn't just about pass, fail, is this device vulnerable or not. It's about how do these things interact, how are they configured, how do I manage users even on these systems. And I think this is where a lot of the real opportunity for Sarah comes in, is how do we create a way for people to express some of this system level thinking in a way that allows us to make broader security decisions and broader kind of drive our actions based on how the system performs as a whole, not just how one individual device is configured, because that's too narrow.
Well, no, I completely agree. A risk-based approach is the only way to do it. The problem is that everybody focuses on a risk-based approach that follows an IT framework of CIA. So in an ICS world, the concept of a user doesn't exist at the device level. So how do you deal with that? I mean, these are basic concepts that we end up having to do more on education than really trying to solve the problem. And that, you know, there are these people that believe that we can just replace every vulnerable device that exists, but I'm sorry, we don't have that wealth to do that. So you have to realize that most of these systems don't have all of those mechanisms that you think a standard computing environment would.
Well, and let me turn this around to you. Have you seen a model where this works really well, and could we learn from that? Because I see a lot of people stumbling in the dark around a lot of this stuff, and if you know of a model that works really well, then to me that feels like a good thing for us to talk about.
No, oh, absolutely. But who's this talking? I don't recognize the voice.
Oh, this is Dwayne from Tripwire.
Okay. No, we obviously have issues. So, and again, in a general open call where it's unclear exactly who's listening, a lot of these comments won't be shared. But it's very easy to demonstrate how easy it is to compromise systems if you know these systems. And that's why we're still shaving the outer surface of a monster iceberg right now. These advisories that are being issued are from beginners that probably haven't really done a lot in the true industrial space. So they're really still not going after the pot of gold. They're playing. And where I worry is when this thing's actually going to explode, right? The Pandora's box opens. Because you'll notice they still don't tend to go after the core bread and butter DCSs. Most of this work is taking place on SCADA systems, which when rubber meets the road, the SCADA systems don't have as much direct access to the true physical assets as SCADA systems do. So, you know, you don't see many advisories on DCS level equipment, but that's the stuff that's really representing the risk. So we're kind of waiting to see how that's going to just take off, right?
Hey, Joel, this is Steve Parker. I want to throw a question out your way. You mentioned ICS Serve, that most of their advisories tend to be on Windows or more generic type equipment. Our indicators of compromise that we see come out are almost all internet-facing systems or traditional IT type systems. And I suspect a lot of that is because the control environments aren't monitored. There's not security telemetry there. Nobody's actually watching those, so there's no mechanism to get that information about vulnerabilities or attacks that could then be shared.
That's true. That's true.
I guess the follow-up to that would be, kind of as Chris was mentioning, a lot of these environments are very unique. So from a sharing perspective, it's easy to understand how sharing information about email spam can then be used by others to block that same spam. Does that concept, does that translate into in industrial control system environments, or are each environment so unique that there's not really a data sharing that could be used to help protect the larger ecosystem?
Well, I think the issue still is on this idea, this premise, that all of the threats are external threats. So again, since we really don't have an enormous database of events because nobody shares them, in general, those that are shared reveal that the threats are internal threats. Yet, let's just say the vast majority of technology that's being introduced is all geared at securing the perimeter. That, in my opinion, is flawed, because the attack can originate inside and succeed inside because nobody does anything inside. So I agree that Sarah is a key, and I've been saying this for years myself. You have to have visibility because you can't protect what you can't see. But this problem needs to get buy-in from a lot bigger entities than us sitting around here saying, yeah, it's a great idea. So you need the vendors to want to endorse it because they're the bottleneck right now. They will continue to be the bottleneck. And I'm using the term general. The major vendors have got to embrace the concept. And until they do, we're going to get little progress because they control the vast majority of installations. So you look at the big plants, the big projects, the integrator tends to be the vendor. If it's not the vendor, it tends to be the engineering company. So the third-party integrators, again, they're not the ones that are doing big projects. They're doing a lot of small ad hoc projects. So that's why we always have to talk very sector specific. So, you know, you talk about building a power plant. Some small mom and pop shops probably not going to be doing that work. One of the big players is, whether it's one of the big engineering houses or one of the big vendors. So they're the ones that are going to have to be sold on this. And that's a tough sell.
So a comment or two onto that, and also just procedural stuff. So we're an hour in. This is a 90-minute session, so we've got another half hour to go. I know some people will have to go to the top of the hour, so feel free to contact us for any follow-ons. There's a number of questions I want to at least touch on and raise as we go as well. And Joel, just to your point, he's exactly right. And these are, you know, the very first point you brought up is important. You know, I probably shouldn't have, or at least, you know, have using the Windows or the vulnerable device example is a little pointillistic. You know, what we need for situational awareness is awareness, you know, of what things are and how they are, and the ability to see when they change. You know, whether it's someone trying to attack a vulnerable device, or, you know, an internal person doing something, you know, cranking up RPMs on a rotating mass, or increasing temperatures and so forth. You know, so when Sarah is the act of gathering standard techniques to establish, you know, some or much of this, and over time it will be interesting to see how it goes, because as most of us here on the phone know, we're all at least IT or control system folks, and we understand the network traffic and device configuration side of things. But there's that actual ICS, or there's actually the actual controlled system, that's molten steel and electricity and chemicals. And obviously the facility operators have to be aware of those systems all the time, and that's at the end the only thing that really matters. And to your point as well, there's at your last point, I couldn't agree more. The vendors have to buy in, and it's one of the purposes of this ISAC is it's become quite clear over our first year of operation that the vendors themselves and the integrators haven't had a community to join to push their interest and their voice and their concerns into space. So a lot of the vendors are in our membership. Some of them are on the panel. I know some of them are in the audience, listening to this particular session as part of the session. And we do have to have buy-in. I think it's one of the areas that's been missed. With the Amber Alert from ICS CERT several months ago, and I'll use this as a bridge to get into some of the questions that have been raised. So one of the questions was, the security issue requires trusted communications. Is it feasible these days? One of the people in the audience asked that earlier. And we can look at an instance like an Amber Alert that took 2 months to develop, coming out from the ICS CERT, that was about ongoing attacks against power systems and water systems. Many of the people on this call, many of the major vendors and integrators and other people who are building and managing these systems and building the devices for these systems were not allowed to have access to that alert. However, the Washington Post got it and ran an article the next day. So, when to the person who asking the question, I think it is a big question. How do we do secure communications? What does that mean when we share knowledge and information? How do we do that? And part of the answer is that you can only secure things for periods of time. A bank vault is measured in hours. Not how impossible it is to break. When we share information with anyone, again, Snowden, obviously that didn't work real well. Does the NSA need to stop talking to themselves and their own contractors? No. When we're sharing information, we need to think about EnergySec and the ICS ISAC can share information at a certain level. We can share information with our membership in a certain way. Everybody agrees, signs onto the same membership agreement that has some text in it, some legal framework for how we'll share information, how we won't share information. But as in the general case, as we look at the entire knowledge sharing structure, which is basically everybody, we need to look at the perishable value of knowledge over time. And folks are asking about contact information. If you will, I see the one person there. Anybody else that wants contact information for the panelists can ping info@ics-isac.org, and we'll get back to you on those things. So with all of that, Zach, I'd like to give you a little bit of floor since the rest of us have been taking it up. In the meantime, I know we haven't. I think most people here are familiar with Tripwire's technology and the kind of tools and approaches they have. Is there anything you want to say about this? Because I like this open source project, the Sentry HQ stuff you guys are doing. Is there anything about that type of approach in this context you want to mention?
Sure. I know we've been talking about gaining situational awareness across devices that are running different operating systems and that may be exposed or not exposed to the public internet. And right now, what we're trying to do is figure out how what we've built can be useful. What we've built is an open source platform where people can go on and share attack detection code and attack response code. But the interesting thing from a configuration and situational awareness perspective is that you can actually detect attacks on different types of machines and respond on other machines instantly, and share code that can do both of those things, both the detection side and the attack response side instantly. So whether it's a Windows machine or whatever, or a router or whatnot, if you have the agent for this open source project, SentryHQ, running on your machine, and you detect an incident in one part of your facility, you can respond in any other part. So, I mean, that's our general approach. We're still trying to fine-tune that and see how it could really, I guess, see who specifically could benefit. But I think that generally speaking, in 5 to 10 years, people will have great situational awareness tools and great configuration management tools, and we're trying to make it easy to script up detectors and responses, and really let people deploy these things to all different parts of their infrastructure, not just their Windows machines, because that has limited value. Yeah, I'd say that's where our open source project is moving right now.
Yeah, that's which is neat stuff. I'm interested to see how that all unfolds over time. Mark Blackmore, I see your comment out there as well. I'll read that out, and if you want to join us on audio, just click your hand raise thing, and I'll take you off mute as well. Oh, the heck, I'll take you off mute anyways. You're Mark. We all know you. You want to say that point, because I think that's the point of the conversation, the kind of crux to all of this. So Mark, you're off.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay, Chris?
Yeah, you're great.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to Joel's point, I definitely agree where he's coming from. But some of the things that I've seen being, both in the IT, so please excuse me, but then on the vendor side, it's the reality of where we are is, I don't know. I've been doing this for a long time, and when I go into some customers and I would talk about how we could defend from this type or the other threat, or really get into some of the juicy stuff, I've often found that just the basics aren't being done, and a lot of times too, it's because the folks I'd be talking to are just so overwhelmed that they're not focused, rightly or wrongly or whatever their circumstances are. They're not just focused on cybersecurity. They get a ton of other things to do. And that just even dealing with the basics, you'd find you'd have to go back and do a lot of education. So before you could get into either, if you want to call it the really cool stuff, or just really where the really bad threats are going to come from, these guys weren't even doing the basics. So if you use the analogy of they're just leaving the front door open, so a lot of the effort was just to get them to close the front door, and then we can talk about putting in motion detectors or whatever analogy you want to use. So that, I guess that's the thing, and what my interest in Sarah is as well, is if we can just start with getting that kind of level set across, at least it raises the game that much more, because if you just a USB stick is all it'll take in a lot of places. So that's all the point that I want to raise there. I do definitely agree with what Joel was saying, but we're, not to sound alarmist, but we're kind of in a world of hurt, and I think just getting those basics addressed is of prime importance.
Yeah, and this is the topic of another one of our panels. I forget which month, but so every third Wednesday we do these panels, and the topic is something like emergent properties of doing. And in that conversation, we're going to drive the conversation to exactly Mark's point that there are a lot of things we need to do. Mostly, we need to start doing them. And in this area, I agree with Mark. I think that, and I think Joel's really saying the same sort of thing as well. That we and I hear this sort of thing all the time. This is in fact why we're here and why we've started the Sarah project and so forth, is because in a lot of these conversations, this is all we do at the center every day. We have these conversations all day long, and there's a lot of agreement now, in the same way as there wasn't a year or 2 or 3 ago, that now is the time to start doing things. And with the pilot that that everybody on the panel here and others on the phone are already involved with, we'll put some things in place that at least can be done, that will close some of the open windows and doors, and hopefully and that can be adopted. So it's the point is, like, anytime you're trying to address something, if you're mowing the lawn, right? You mow it down at least I do, mow it down the center, and then you've got half. You do that half, we can finish that half, now we can do the other half. In this area, we need to start getting some things done. There's a lot of very basic things we can do, so that if someone from the inside or the outside starts doing new and exciting things without authorization, at least it can be seen. At least somebody can do something about it. I mean, the reality is that we are in a scary position. We have, as a nation, in the U.S. alone, much less anywhere else, no clue, no ability to determine whether or not we just came under attack during this call. We won't know. We live in a world where a well-designed attack could happen faster than the 90 minutes we'll spend here today. We've got to fix that. And we can't fix it in 20 years or 50 years or 100 years. We've got to fix it in the next couple of years. How do we do that? Not by boiling the ocean. So hopefully with these sorts of cooperative developments, and the specific work we see across the industry, the STIX and TAXI and the REN ISAC and SIF and what some of the vendors, and all the vendors, to some extent are doing. We can start addressing parts of the problem and at least lay some groundwork that isn't contentious. So we are 75 minutes into our call. I know we can talk almost instantly on these topics. We have, just look at the question list while we're here. And so everybody, again, knows that all the questions are captured and everybody will follow up with afterwards. There are some questions from some people who have some companies and startups. Thor, and raise your hand if you'd like to get taken off mute. Is a question. I have a startup company that's working in risk and security, physical IT, etc., for the food supply chain and industry, food defense. Would you be willing to share trends, standards, and set up a relationship to share information and data in the future? And there's Thor. Okay, let me take you off mute. Hello, Thor. Pleased to meet you.
Hey, just find this fascinating. I was actually referenced to this webinar by a entity, the state of California, and we're dealing with basically what you guys are, what we're talking about here for the food industry, and saying food defense, food security, looking at it, infrastructure, and saying, hey, what can we learn from other industries, and how can we put this together into a comprehensive program. And you know, Sarah, I had nothing to know of that before I got on this call, but you know, just sitting there saying, hey, here's a new area that people are sitting there looking at, and you know, as a case study, what could or would you or anyone be able to provide to say, here, you've got a new industry that you're going to go into to do this security stuff, and how would you put it down a roadmap for this, and what would your guidance and wisdom be?
I'll put a short comment in there, and Steve and the other guys on the panel, if you want to say any part of this, feel free. And I appreciate getting an echo from you, Thor. So you can do yourself perfect. So Food and Ag was the first ISAC, and it started and failed early in the late 90s because no one came to the table to share information. And it's one of the sectors that obviously, when you start thinking about it, is extremely critical. There are terrible things you can do to food systems, and that would obviously have negative impacts. And on behalf of the ICS ISAC, would say, absolutely yes. We're very interested. Our focus is cross-sector. We've actually been making, poking at the food sector, trying to find points where we can get some traction. Like everything else we're talking about here, I think doing something is a good catalyst. Once we have an example in a sector, a geography, in a any portion of the greater picture we can point to, then that can work with others. Any other thoughts of the panel on food and ag?
Well, I have just some comments in general. I mean, some of this feels a lot like, I think we have a tendency to jump right to security, and getting kind of back, I might sound like a broken record about risk, but to me, like, if you look at Six Sigma, for example, you build SIPOC diagrams and you figure out who your suppliers are, how they interact, what processes, what your outputs are, how you affect your customers, what the requirements are, all through this process. And generally, I like to start with not what is the security problem, but get a better understanding of, the value stream. What service are we delivering? What components are involved in that? And then you start digging into, okay, where would we be vulnerable to an insider attack or to an outside threat? What could go wrong? Do we have any single points of failure? How do we monitor whether things are in place and effective? And to me, that same kind of a model would apply to any process or any distribution-oriented business, including food, where you could start with a high-level business view and then start drilling into, okay, what threats would we be concerned about? How would we monitor for those? How would we detect them? How would we respond? And then it would fit pretty nicely into the SARA framework. So at least that's my initial reaction.
Well said. So Steve, there's another question I want to throw your way, folks, because you've been there. But it's what the panelists think regarding allowing regulators access to the information sharing table. And Steve, I'm going to take you off mute as well if you want to join in this. So there you are, off mute. So
sure. Thank you.
Steve, if you want to.
Can you guys hear me okay?
You're lovely.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you to Dwayne, Zach, and Steve for being on the panel. And really, I mean, it's an interesting question that I posed that can affect any one of the, infrastructures, finance sector, chemical sector, food sector with FDA and our Department of Agriculture. I mean, we have a lot of the different regulators that are going to want access to information sharing portals, so on and so forth. And so in my particular area is energy, and we have an ES ISAC that does share some stuff that's been very highly cleansed with me as a regulator or a monitoring agency of the standards that the energy sector has to comply with. So my question for the panelists, and it doesn't matter to me if you focus on energy. I mean, Steve, of course, your background is there, but any of the sectors that you'd be willing to share, what your take is on allowing regulators access to the information, or at least access to the table, and then how we can do that efficiently and productively, so that we don't want to scare anybody from sharing stuff, but we also don't want to create a witch hunt scenario. And so I think it's a balancing act. But I'd just be curious about your July 2013 impression or take on allowing regulators to the information sharing table.
Well,
Are you asking about specifically threat information, or just about kind of operational information? What level of information do you want to give them access to?
Yeah, it's basically access to information sharing that the ISACs are doing, or that the people are working with. So it could be threat, it could be attack vectors, it could be for example, a lot of the stuff that I see come across my desk has to deal with threats and awareness type stuff. Of course, I also get access to events that have occurred in the sector that may or may not be shared at the ISAC. So it would be all three of those: threats, awareness stuff, and then actual events that have occurred. So I mean, whatever the ISACs are sharing. I mean, I know what some of the ISACs share, but not all of them.
Well, I'll jump up and address that a little bit. I think I think it can have a very chilling effect on information sharing. And again, it's going to depend on the context, the type of information that's going to be shared and such. The one example that's used oftentimes is the airline industry, where there's a I think it's the near miss accident reporting or something like that. I forget the exact name, but it's a it's actually run by NASA, so it's not run by the FAA at all. It's run by NASA, and pilots, controllers, anybody involved in the industry can report an incident that happened, and then they use it to generate, improve the practices within the industry and to learn the things that are actually happening. The problem with sharing information with regulators is that the regulatory process is, at least in the legal sense, it's adversarial. Maybe not in the practical sense, you're not beating each other up, but from a legal perspective, it's adversarial. So there's, entities are going to be very reluctant to share information that could then be used against them in that adversarial relationship from a legal perspective. So there's a real challenge. I think I would throw the question back at you and say, what benefit would the regulators hope to gain by having access to the information sharing table? If their primary role is to regulate,
Yep.
Well,
I have a very straightforward answer to that. That's so very applicable to where the energy sector is going with the risk assurance initiative, or reliability assurance initiative. It's based on risk. So we want to start focusing on the risk areas instead of treating everybody the same. And every standard the same. We want to be able to take and streamline and pinpoint where we're focusing our auditing, where we're focusing our oversight and reviews. Obviously, everything's mandatory. You have to do everything, but we don't necessarily review every single thing on every one of our audits because of the different tiers that are occurring now with our area, and they risk rank and they rationalize the requirements. So that's the vision, is that we focus more on the risk areas. So for example, if insider threats are really going up, we're going to focus in on SIP 4R3, making sure that they're doing personal risk assessments on their employees. If patch management attacks are happening significantly, we're going to focus on SIP 7R3. So those are some examples where if we know that the trends of attack and the trends of events and outages are because of A, insiders, or B, lack of patch management, therefore as a regulator we can then hone our focus and educate and focus our mitigation plans on those higher risk areas, because we're seeing a direct impact and correlation between what's actually occurring and the information that's being shared, and then of course the requirements that are being regulated. And I do want to recognize, I appreciate the fact that certain information may need to get anonymized, so for us to get our value out of it. I don't necessarily need to know what entity's name is, but if I know that they're a transmission operator and they have this particular system in place and it's getting attacked, so on and so forth, because of lack of patches, it's very helpful for me to then go and work on the mitigation plans with any entities there and say, hey, we got to make sure that your mitigation plans are taking this stuff into consideration. So that's a very real world answer to your question, Steve.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense, seeing things at that level. Go ahead, is that Dwayne?
That was Chris, actually. Let me just thank the Department of Transportation and George Washington University, who are pointing out that that's called the Aviation Safety Reporting System, the ASRS that you're mentioning, Steve. And it's that, it's what everybody else knows. So Steen is with the Midwest Reliability Organization, so he's, as you said, a regulator thinking about these things. But it speaks to a lot of the answers to the questions came out earlier and points are brought up. Dwayne, you had mentioned, the how you folks and a lot of vendors out there get a lot of information. Our people are already sharing it, but so it's one thing to as a financial organization, for example, to let your antivirus or your anti-spam vendor get anonymized information about your experience. It's another one to let the payment card industry council, security council get it. Are you going to get fined or not fined? So it's the answer to all of this has to be, effectively, yes, we're not idiots. We're not going to take all the information about all the infrastructure, pile it in one spot where it can be broken and hackers can kill us all. We're not going to put in place situations where every asset owner has to completely open the phone to every regulator and everybody's going to sue them, for everything. We need to and we can put in place systems where Steam can get the information he wants. The regulators understand. They don't want to get yelled at by everybody. They want to do their jobs. But to know that Steve, you said this exactly as I comes out of my mouth quite often, that it's just need to know transmission organizations in your realm had a certain type of issue, or they never did. Should you spend any time trying to help on that issue, or should you spend all of your time trying to help on that issue? It depends. Is it a problem? When we look at, among our membership, the asset owners, municipalities, and so forth, we quite often turn the question around. When we get asked, what information do you need? The question is, what information do you need? As an asset owner, what do you want to know? And we quite often get back, very useful things that can be shared. I'd like to know whether other municipalities are having these issues. So, there's lots of information that can be shared for lots of positive ends. That doesn't run into the elephant in the room objections that frankly take up too much of the oxygen. So with that, we're past, we're 26 minutes, so we only got a few minutes left. Dwayne, you were going to make a point as well, and I'd like to
just a comment that I can't really say how things should be, but when we work with a lot of people who are subject to NERC, and we do a lot with helping them assess where they are, what they have, how vulnerable it is, how it maps to risk, and things like that, and then help create some audit-ready reports. But generally, the organizations that I work with, it's more like stick with name, rank, and serial number until the regulator asks for specific information. And I don't want to just open up and have free access to everything. It's to structure it generally around what controls, what are the known risks, what are the controls I have in place, and here's some evidence that they're in place and effective. So I would say from a regulatory perspective, I'd be less comfortable if people started digging in and saying, okay, what risks have, show me all the problems you're worried about, rather than if they have access to generally what's being shared across the community, then you can start asking, okay, well, we've seen these risks, we're concerned about them, how are you as an organization dealing with this? I think it's different to say, I have generally available information, I'm going to ask you questions about how you're protecting yourself against these risks, versus digging in to every little incident in your ticketing system to find out, I'm going to ask specifically about this. So it's I don't want to start with full access. I want to have them get to that if they find things that concern them, if that makes sense.
It does to me.
So it's, let them find the smoke before I show them the fire.
Well, so Steve, you have a sharing.
Go ahead.
So we're down to the last 2 minutes. I'd like to respect people's time. So Steve, if you want to have a last statement, and Zach, and then we'll let Debbie dance this all out.
Yeah, just very quickly to wrap up, I know we talked about a lot of different things today, and there's a lot of work to do, and I think there's some problems that are unsolved, and I know that the group here on this call, I think it has a great interest in solving them, so hopefully we can continue the conversation and really focus on delivering some things that people can latch onto and say that has value and I want to do that, because that's ultimately what's going to make change.
Absolutely. Zach, you want to add a word of wisdom?
I just say there's a lot I learned today. It's a great panel, and I really like the risk before security perspective, if you will. I'll be thinking about that a lot going forward.
Great. And my last word, I think, again, I think now is the time to address these issues. That it's been many years building up to bring us to this point, and it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over the next 12 and 24 months. But I think a lot of the questions that we all have will be answered that time, and I'm looking forward to working with everybody involved to see how it turns out. So with that, Debbie, it's the floor and the rest is yours.
Steve, Zach, Dwayne, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights that you've shared today. And to our audience, on behalf of all of us at the ICS ISAC, we appreciate your joining us today. We hope that you found the information of value and something that you can take and implement to further secure your industrial control systems. Our next member briefing will be held Wednesday, August 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, and feature a panel of distinguished subject matter experts presenting Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. Other sessions will be announced in our monthly updates, on the Center's website, and in our other communication vehicles. Thank you again for your participation on today's call.